I'm your host. My name's Davina, actually. And DavKat's a pseudonym that I used for 3 years because I was afraid under the Trump administration that I would be doxxed and harassed and that my family might incur negative consequences as a result of my activism to help promote Trump being removed from office. Oh, I forgot to turn on the light. Here we go. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about Jared Kushner and the Middle East right now, by which I specifically mean Israel, and the fairly lopsided conflict happening there at the moment. The bombing of the Associated Press building, whereby lots of journalists were narrowly evacuated in time, and a lot of expensive media equipment was destroyed. And people, it's trickling out. People are seeing more photos or videos of injured and killed children who've lost their lives in this conflict, because Gaza is an occupied territory, the West Bank is occupied. There is a death by 1,000 cuts movement to dispossess Palestinians from their homes and disenfranchise essentially people who are not Jewish from that region. It's territorial expansionism, and that isn't to say that I condone the response of Hamas, which is rather than try to diplomatically defeat the colonialist expansion of Israel through illegal settlements, internationally deemed illegal Israeli settlements. I don't support Hamas bombing or rocket fire towards Israel. But at the same time, I recognize that a lot of the world has been content to support Israel, and certainly a lot of the world has been content to support the US as they pay $3.8 billion a year towards Israel for military assistance, so that they can defend themselves against some of their hostile neighbors. And that includes a lot of hostility towards Israel in the occupied territories. Nevertheless, you can't give up on diplomatic solutions. And it's certainly not okay for Israel to be taking advantage of America's support to act as the aggressor in using court challenges to dispossess people from homes that they've lived in for decades after hundreds of thousands of Palestinians left their homes in the Nakba of 1948 when Israel was created. And their story is often left out of Israel's origin story. It didn't happen in a vacuum. There are a lot of Palestinian refugees, and a lot of them would like to return home. Marsha's here. She says, "Hey, Davina, I know there's a lot of immersing in pro-Israel assumptions that people might not even realize were assumptions. So I'm very grateful to one man who's Jewish like myself, and he wrote a thread about what it's like to be brought up. I'll read his thread to you. It says, as Jews, we are told from a young age that our identities are intrinsically tied to the modern state of Israel. It is taught to us in Hebrew school and services, and is a deeply held belief by many of our parents, grandparents, and family members. It is reinforced by media and politicians who repeatedly link Jewish identity with the state of Israel. The flip side of this message is that criticism of Israel is a negation of our identity. I'll read that sentence again. It's important. A flip side of this message is that criticism of Israel is a negation of our identity. Even if not explicitly anti-Semitic, the saying goes, the thinking goes, those who criticize Israel must be doing so because they harbor some anti-Semitic attitudes. This conflation of religious communal identity with a faraway nation state is reinforced constantly and repeatedly. Palestinians do not even factor into this story. When reality forces us to reckon with their existence, we are told that they are terrorists, warmongers who hate the Jews, and are violent by nature. which is Islamophobia, by the way. The story of the Nakba, the mass expulsion of Palestinians from their ancestral land in 1948, is left out entirely. 1948 is merely the year Israel gained independence. Who knew Palestinians were part of that story? Needless to say, the constant conflation of Jewish identity with one state's politics is not good for the Jews. It reduces the personal to the political. It strips Jews of the ability to define their own relationship with their identity. For non-Jews, it signals that if you support Israeli policies, then you can't be anti-Semitic, and that if you are critical of Israeli policies, you therefore hate the Jews, both of which are lies. It can be very difficult to unlearn. For years, I understood that Netanyahu and settlers were bad actors, but my senses would go off when I heard people talk about boycotts or divestment. Israel not be perfect, the thinking went, but the grassroots efforts to change those policies must be anti-Semitic. In truth, Israel is a state, like many others, founded on the displacement of others. Its Jewish exclusivity is predicated on the exclusion of millions who continue to live on that land. Political exclusion based on religion, by definition, leads to hatred, repression, and eventually ethnic cleansing. Jews should know this more than anyone. That is why it is so deeply important for Jews in the diaspora to speak out, to reject an ideology that reduces Judaism to political support for Israel and reduces support for Israel to Jewish exclusivity. To recognize that Israel is a state, like others, that oppresses and dispossesses the powerless, and that the only way to end that oppression is to give those people equal rights and self-determination, just as we yearned for as Jews. Since lots of folks are sharing this, he writes, I'll just say that there are real historical reasons for all this. Centuries of pogroms, the Holocaust, the centrality of the land in our texts. And yet none of them justify permanent occupation and dispossession of non-Jews. So I'm very grateful to that man for writing that piece. His name is Jeremy Slevin. Oh, he's the communications strategy consultant for Ilan Oman of Minnesota. Well, it's getting shared, but it's going to go down like a lead balloon for the Democrats, isn't it? Which is sad because there's a lot of support for Israel from the side of Republicans for whom they have evangelical Christian backing, and a lot of evangelical Christian belief is bound up in the rapture, and preconditions for the rapture include this kind of arbitrary fantasy that when Israel is entirely occupied by Jews, not any non-Jews, just Jews, that's when the rapture will occur. So they want Muslims to be dispossessed from Israel because it's part of their mythology. It's part of evangelical Christian mythology that in order for Jesus to come a second time, there has to be ethnic cleansing in Israel, and everybody who's not Jewish has to leave. Oh, good. Marsha notes that this is how we grew up, and she does also feel that there is room to criticize Israel for what's going on. She's horrified by the Israeli response, and yes, at the same time, horrified by Hamas, and agrees with my assessment. Yes, because Hamas is also oppressive to its own people. It's not a functional democratic political party. There's some similarities to Republicans, only they'll more actively shoot you to terrorize or intimidate you if you disagree with Hamas and you live in Palestine or you live in a Palestinian territory. Palestine, unfortunately, doesn't have a nation state status still because they don't have equal status to negotiate for those type of outcomes, having a nation state, because they're so heavily backed by the number one global superpower, which is the United States. So without changing the hearts and minds of a supermajority of Americans, you can't get justice and self-determination and autonomy for the Palestinian people, because it's not enough to win a simple majority for Democrats in the United States. It's not enough to win a simple majority for people who believe in the dignity and rights of others. You have to get a supermajority because American politics is stacked in Republicans' favor because of the electoral college system, which overturns the popular vote in favor of minority voters who are empowered through the electoral college to exercise disproportionate influence through their single votes. Bob is here and says, my son-in-law, who is Jewish, said the Israeli state is following the Dahia doctrine. I'm not familiar with that. Feel free to let me know. Knowledge El Shabazz is here and says, hello. Hello, Knowledge. Nice to see you. All right. I want to show everybody something else because I do think democracy is still at significant risk in the United States, and that if the Republicans are able to take back the House majority in 2022, that they will do their best to gum up the works of American democracy even more. They'll obstruct all legislation. They'll make sure the principal business of the House is to try and impeach Joe Biden for whatever made up made up fairy tales they want to tell about Joe Biden. Sheldon's here and says hello. Hello, Sheldon. I have to go hang out with my children and stop them from watching TV very shortly. But I'm going to play Ben Dominic. I don't know if he's Jewish, but Dominic sounds kind of Jewish. He might not be. He's Meghan McCain's husband anyway. He's John McCain's son-in-law, and he's here on Fox News. I'm just playing this extract of him because it's such a good summary of the fabricated position of the Republican Party. And when you listen to it and see for yourself how untethered it is from reality and how fascist it is in terms of its appeal to emotion, to say we are the genuine Americans, and people in corporations, people who profess to be woke, the people with money, they're all the elites. And it's an appeal to strengthen the white working class support for Trump, or the white middle class support for Trump that happens to not really have a college education, because a college education is not a guarantee to vaccination against this style of rubbish, but it increases your chances of being able to resist the lure of the false superiority offered by white supremacists like Ben Dominic. Marsha says, we've been taught not to criticize Israel, but the allowance of the settlers, along with moving the capital to Jerusalem, did nothing but inflame the situation. True, and it's been like that for decades. It's just getting worse, that's all. The trajectory is not up. Palestinians have been accorded secondary citizen status for a long time, not able to access the same job opportunities, taxi drivers not able to drive people in the same areas of town, and of course the blockade of the economic and physical blockade of Gaza, meaning that people cannot flourish, have social mobility, have economic opportunity in the same way that they would have if Gaza wasn't a blockaded territory. Now, I will say some of that is a function of the sort of terrorist nature of Hamas, which is elected, but in the same way that Donald Trump was elected, I presume that there's emotional manipulation as a key factor in keeping undiplomatic, violent people in charge, and violent people who will also turn against their own constituents and shoot them in the kneecaps for disagreeing with them. So Hamas are not a healthy, democratic political party. They shoot a lot of rockets at the people of Israel, which is not an easily tolerable situation. But at the same time, the dynamics can't be changed by just wishing for Hamas to improve, and because then you're passively acquiescing to Israel's approach, which is ethnic cleansing of the region to keep oppressing people until they move away or die out. Yes, Bob notes that the Palestinians are in one of the largest open prisons in the world, and we could say they are being collectively punished for their government. All right, this is Ben Dominic. I'm going to listen to him, and then I'm going to go have a quick debrief about it and then hang out with my children. This is 44 seconds of Ben Dominic propagandizing to a presumably dominant white audience and a gullible audience.
As for the wars here at home, the ones that matter over the very culture of the nation, when it comes to those, they fade away. They'll leave those to you, the people. The crisis we face today goes to the heart of what kind of nation we will be. As in 1776, it is a question of who rules. Is it the globalist tech oligarchs, Hollywood executives beholden to China, the race radicals who dominate our universities, a fundamentally anti-American media, the frail, feeble politicians, and the Marxist children of the left? Or is it us, the American people, a great people, a free people, who above all care not for money or power, but for the nation we love?
So that, the dangerousness of that type of rhetoric, I just want to highlight it. He describes a bunch of people, politicians, Marxist children, and then says, contrast those with us, Americans. So you're American now if you watch Fox News and you agree with the Fox News host. You're not American if, say, you're in your 20s and you have a bit of a colorful idea about Marxism. I don't agree with people on the left who think Stalin was worth revering. I don't have any political patience for them, but I won't say that they're un-American or no, I'll say that their ideas lack historical grounding, and I'll say I think their ideas are dangerous, but I won't say they're not American and only the fundamentally under-regulated capitalist Fox News viewers are true Americans, because that's rhetoric that asks for violence and asks you to kill your enemies. They're not American and you are. And it will show repeatedly footage of things being burnt in order to inflame your senses, in order to arouse you physiologically for violence. So that's just my point about that people need to stay energized and stay ready to avail ourselves of the power and synergy of collective action. There was a resistance on Twitter. There were people coming together to organize campaigns and organize turning out strategies to mobilize voters to eject Trump from office and to eject Trump co-conspirators from office in 2018 and 2020. And we have to keep up that spirit of mutual support, group solidarity, and collective action to preserve decency and to preserve democracy. I'm going to look up a definition of democracy right now, because to my mind, through discussion of definitions and the basics of civics is one way to help rehabilitate democracy in the face of rising fascism. So democracy, I'm noting from Google, is a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. So democracy, system of government, all the people in the population. And when it says all the eligible members of a state, I'd like to note that in Israel, various Palestinian people aren't even eligible to vote, or they have second-tier voting rights. So that is, by definition, a type of apartheid where you have different categories of citizenship. And in America, there is an unspoken category of citizenship whereby people will deprive certain communities of the resources they need to be able to easily exercise their right to vote. So it is a type of second-tier citizenship if you're a Black African American, and the Republican Party has said, we're just standardizing polling booth locations, one for a rural area, one for an urban area with 10 times the population, meaning there will be queues for hours and hours, and that Black Americans will have a poll tax inflicted on them that is taxing their time. And their time is money, because if you have to pay for a sitter so you can go and wait in line to vote, and that voting period extends from 8 to 12 hours. That's a poll tax, and it's anti the 24th Amendment of the Constitution. This has been Civics with DavKat, and I'm going to note that a commentator from YouTube is saying Fox News is part of the media. What alternate reality do Fox viewers live where it's not? Well, that's how easy it is to manipulate people with an appetite for superiority complex food. They are being fed the lie that Fox isn't the media, because the media are all those people who keep saying that there was an insurrection. The media keeps saying there's something that's climate change. The media is them, and Fox News is not the media because it's us. We who are prepared to indulge our appetites for self-delusion. We and Fox who are prepared to say, we are the true Americans. Everybody else is an elite or a libtard or a baby-eating Democrat. They're prepared to lie extensively, pardon me, about other people in order to solidify their group identity, which is fueled by hatred for the other. Paul's here. Hello, Paul. Bob saw video of Associated Press leaving their office in Gaza before they were bombed. So they had merely an hour's notice. People had to grab their equipment and run. It's a big deal to bomb a journalist building. But I would note, everybody should know that Netanyahu is inciting this on purpose because he was about to be ousted from government. He sort of lost an election, but because they have multiple parties, it's not as outright as one person defeated the other. There was going to be some parties forming a coalition government that wasn't going to involve Netanyahu because he's escalated the conflict, because he's launched attacks on Gaza. There's now too much kerfuffle for people to be able to organize him out of government, to organize a coalition to hold power that doesn't include the corrupt leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's been in office for a long time. He has used that fascist technique of cementing a them versus us approach so that people then invest their loyalty in him as a protector, as somebody who's going to be more clear about the demarcations between them and us. And they intuitively feel that that will keep them safe. It won't, because he's now purposefully attracting more Hamas rocket fire because of the way in which he's approaching peace, i.e. expand the settlements that have already been condemned as illegal, expel Palestinians from their home a bit at a time, until they say, hang on, this is not a mass expulsion, this is death by 1,000 cuts. We have to make a stand and protest the expulsion of these people from their homes, their ancestral homes that they've lived in for decades since being expelled from Israel, and to fuel conflict with them so that he gets to stay in charge. All of this death, all of the bodies of murdered children that we see with their limbs torn from their bodies with white phosphorus covering their face, these horrific photos and videos are a product of Benjamin Netanyahu doing anything he can to stay in power, and it is working for him. So that's just a really critical message I wanted to get across to people, that we do need to hold Benjamin Netanyahu to account. We do need to acknowledge that it's difficult for the Democrats in power to do so because their hold on power is so tenuous. Negative partisanship often ensures the party in opposition has a big win in midterm elections. So Democrats are wary about alienating important subsections of their voters. And Democratic Jewish voters are very likely to have been programmed since birth or indoctrinated into automatic support of Israel, and more importantly, automatic distrust of anybody who criticizes Israel and says Israel needs to change course. They'll feel like, oh, well, even if Israel's not perfect, those demands that Israel do things differently and treat Palestinians with more respect, they must be fueled at some level with anti-Semitism, and therefore we shouldn't cave to that, and we should still let Democrats know that our donations and our support is contingent on them still saying that the US will continue to unequivocally support Israel. And something's got to give. I hope it's that the Democrats can manage the situation and the tightrope they have to walk to not alienate a critical amount of voters so that then they lose and Republicans get back in power. Republicans are even worse to the Palestinians, although I can see how it's difficult sometimes to differentiate between the Republican response to the Palestinian conflict and the Republican response. But Republicans are more earnest about it. Democrats feel more that they have to, because of the power and expansive influence of the right wing in America through very established media channels such as Fox News, Sinclair News, right wing radio, Rush Limbaugh, previously speaking. They're the most popular shows on network television or on cable television, and they introduced toxins into American discourse that spread the loyalties of evangelical Americans who desire ethnic cleansing of Israel to just have Jews remain because they believe that to be a precondition for the second coming of Jesus Christ. So Eternal CMO notes that if you criticize the Israeli government, you're often called anti-Semitic. It does feel like we're at a tipping point and maybe more people in the media will be prepared to criticize Israel, given the context of Trump had that opposite position of unequivocally supporting Israel to the detriment of Palestinian interests. He moved the American embassy to give recognition to the capital as being Jewish and Israeli, even though it's contested, and Palestinians also want East Jerusalem for the capital of a two-state solution. Namely, they want to have Palestine with a capital of East Jerusalem, owing to the preponderance of religious sites of religious significance to them in East Jerusalem. So Indoor Smokers is here and gave me a super hard award, which I'm grateful for. Thank you, Indoor Smokers. Oh, look, I left my location up on screen. Oh, that's okay. Yes, I'm in Singapore. Hopefully I don't get doxed too much. I think the right are less prevalent on the internet now than they used to be, but they're still there. They have their own bubbles and they have their own compulsion to their own hysterical attachment to the Trumpian lies of the Republican Party, which the Republicans are using not because they're afraid of Donald Trump. They're using it because they've been exploring all the strategies that they can use for a while now to reform America's democracy into a solidly one-party system, a managed democracy, if you will. It's an effort to manage democracy and choose their own voters all across the United States, where Republicans have dominance within a state legislature, and then they pass laws which pay lip service to the idea of safeguarding election processes, but fundamentally make voting more difficult, which disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged in American communities, which is often the people of color. And they do that knowing that people of color will be more likely to vote for Democrats, and that by doing so, they're entrenching a political advantage for themselves, created at the cost of the freedom and the voting rights and the political power of Black communities. Bo wants to know when the big move is. It's been moved to some point in July because we're still trying to get vaccinated where we are, and it takes a little while. We know that if we move to Boston, we'll likely be able to get vaccinated the same day, but we'd prefer to be vaccinated, we, the adults of our family, before embarking on a train journey. Indoor Smoker says it's a tough one. He supports Israel as a good ally of the US, but he supports the Palestinians too. The fact that you can even say that now, and that more people will start to say that, is at least promising for a long overdue cultural shift of people acknowledging the humanity of Palestinians and acknowledging that that's often something that's been denied or underemphasized in American discourse for a long time. Palestinians have been treated as if they are deserving of collective punishment, as if their status is, collectively speaking, terrorists, and that the Israeli government can have a blank check to do whatever they like. And when I say a blank check, I mean specifically $3.8 billion a year from United States taxpayers. And that is a substantial amount of money to be using to fund the military might of an occupying military power that is also an apartheid state. So Christopher Lucas is here and says, appreciate award. Thank you so much. Guys, I'm going to go. Have a wonderful day. Hope to see you again tomorrow. Have a great rest. And thank you for the quality conversation. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Indoor Smokers, Paul, Bob, Marsha, Eternal CMO. I think that's all. Take care, everybody. Bye.